You have to look at it.
Hello and welcome to Border Crossings. This is a series produced by the Mid-Peninsula Access Corporation. Border Crossings gives you, the viewer, access to regional leaders and policymakers as we explore regional challenges and solutions. In this evening's program, it's about our schools. Graduation season is upon us. Our kids have completed another year of study and growth and are moving on to the next grade, which should be a time of pride and celebration for teachers and students alike, has been marred by the recent massacre of students at Columbine High in Littleton, Colorado. That event and the one just days later in Georgia were either the 6th or 7th time over the past 2 years that students have turned guns randomly at their schoolmates in a variety of communities across America. On top of that, we've had recent threats of violence at 2 schools in Palo Alto, and these events have taken the attention of administrators, parents, and teachers away from the graduation accomplishments. I'm your host, Elliot Margolies, and with me today are 3 school district superintendents: Dr. Don Phillips of the Palo Alto Unified District, Dr. Charlie Mae Knight of the Ravenswood District in East Palo Alto and Menlo Park, and Dr. Meredith Jones of the Menlo Park City School District. So thanks for joining me. I hope I didn't sensationalize the situation beyond what you're ready to deal with. I was telling you all before the show started that when we invited you here, we expected to be dealing with a variety of other kinds of issues, comparing the districts and the challenges that you face. And we hope to go there as well during this hour. And we have questions that were emailed and faxed into us from people in your districts. But because this has grabbed the attention of the community so drastically since the Columbine massacre, I wanted, and because I'm a parent and recently got a letter from Don Phillips that was geared toward what happened after the 2 incidents in Palo Alto schools, we wanted to start there. So my first question is, that day of the Columbine massacre, I'm wondering, is that something that in your offices, does that get reported and it changes the whole day and what you have to do afterwards? Do you remember hearing the news that day and what happened after that?
Yes, I remember hearing the news, and of course, my reaction first was to ensure that the parents felt that their children were safe on our campuses, and to do anything possible to bring about that kind of environment.
So did you suddenly begin to hear calls from parents? Did it change the climate at the school and in the district?
Well, I can recall that the anxiety of the parents certainly was raised, and every little incident, whether a child missed a bus or whether some kids were roughhousing in the park. There were some kids who ran through Flood Park and horse playing. And when we received the story, there was some kids running through the park with guns. And of course, we alerted every policeman in Menlo Park, and they gathered around those poor little kids. And I think there were 6 scared to death. But somehow or another, that kind of climate sort of increased the anxiety among parents and students. And of course, when the students conveyed this to the parents, I'm sure they exaggerated also. Ultimately, the situation was calmed down. The police came out, assured the staff that everything was all well, and that the kids were just roughhousing.
Don, what do you remember the day that the Columbine news came?
Well, I think at first it was a sense of disbelief that something this tragic could happen in one of our schools in the country or anywhere in the world, and obviously worried about the security. But I think at first trying to reach out to Columbine and what had happened there, and trying to be supportive of that community. in any way, and knowing that the community, the parents, the families, the children, students, and administration would all be working to try to make the best of this horrible tragedy. I don't think at the time the impact that it would have on our sense of consciousness about the world we live in and how it might be different, I don't think was clear. And that's often the case with historical events or big events that tend to be turning events. And I think the recent governor's proposal from Governor Davis clearly reflects the events with his emphasis on money and support for school security. If in fact he developed his budget 6 months ago, I think it would have looked very different. So I think it's reverberating and having an impact throughout, and we're having to really rethink how we're doing our business and how do we not create a climate of fear, address that sense of fear, create a sense of calm, but also not try to create promises or that we can't deliver on, and somehow work with the community, because it really is a community issue in terms of how do we create an environment for our kids to grow up, and one that will be safe and productive and really support teaching and learning, things that we value.
What do you think of Governor Davis's emphasis on security in schools? I mean, Meredith, what's your reaction to, are we going overboard?
Well, let me just back up to your original question about my response, and I think it fits into that. Having been around quite a while in this business, I try and make it a practice not to what I call jump reflex. I think the governor's done that. The disappointing to me in this state, and I come from out of state, I've been here 20 months, is that there's this one-size-fits-all mentality. Metal detectors in Menlo Park don't make sense. Metal detectors in inner city schools, and we certainly have them in the East, in certain cases do make sense. They make a lot of sense. So I have trouble with that emphasis.
And yet these massacres or these random shootings have basically been happening in these little towns or
that's right.
Suburban.
But they're going to happen anywhere if they're going to happen. And I think people try to simplify in the sense of it's videos, it's rap music, it's violence on television. It's a much more complex problem as far as I'm concerned, and it can happen anywhere. The part of the governor's budget I support and think is very smart is giving money for counselors. I was shocked to find when I arrived here in this state that schools do not have counselors for children.
That wasn't your experience?
Absolutely not. In all my experience, and this is my 4th school district, we had counselors at every level, not just counselors to deal with high school, college admissions advice, but counselors to help children and families in difficulty or perceived difficulty, counselors who could react when they saw kids in trouble and could react to students who were being isolated.
So do you have counselors in the Menlo Park?
We do have, we do at the middle school, we have one. I don't think one is enough. We don't at the elementary. And we bring in interns from San Francisco State to work a couple of days a week, and that is certainly a help. And we are in the process of looking at, the board is a parcel tax. One component of that would be to fund counselors, but that has nothing. That was not initiated because of Littleton. That was something that of a whole package of.
You mean on your board level?
Right.
But
no.
in terms of counselors, does the Ravenswood District have counselors in the elementary?
No, at one time we did have counselors when we had a budget that would afford counselors, but we do not have counselors in any of our schools.
And Don is?
We do at the middle school and high school level.
Do counselors, what kind of difference can they make? I mean, do kids that, a lot of times kids don't realize the amount of trouble they're in, you know, the amount of problem that they might be facing. Do the counselors actually try to identify kids that look like they need help, or is it all dependent on kids approaching the counselors where you have them?
I think students work and will oftentimes reach out, but it's also the case that teachers, administrators, parents, and in fact other students will come forward and indicate that a student's in need. I think the key ingredient is not just having counselors or psychologists on a campus, but is to make sure that you have connections where every child or every student has a connection with an adult on campus, that somebody's saying hi, I care about you, I value you, how are you doing today? Most of these instances are cases where kids got disconnected. Nobody was paying attention to them, and they got lost in the system. And to try to create enough barriers to protect from all of those eventualities is one where you wouldn't want to go to school in that kind of place, and it wouldn't fit our expectations. And so while we can take precautions, and I think those are good, we really want to be proactive in terms of reaching out to youngsters and making sure they're involved in school activities, engaged in after-school programs, that they're doing their homework, that we're talking to the parents, that we have that partnership, and that if they notice patterns, that then we can reach out and work with them. Once again, it's back to how do you work together to make sure that you're creating an environment that challenges and helps all kids grow, and you have to watch for lots of things inside that setting. But I think
I couldn't agree with him more, and I think that is the absolute key to successful schools, is to create a climate of caring and nurturing for students. And the counselors play one particular role, and I think they're very important. But this whole issue of connection and knowing your students.
Right.
Schools have got to know their students.
A teacher's got 20, 30, sometimes more kids in a room. There's going to be alienated children, kids that are dealing with stuff at home and kids that just don't feel connected. And as much as the schools can reflect that kind of humanism, there's still going to be some outcasts. And
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, how is the climate different today? Do we have to be more frightened about kids that are alienated today than we did? I mean, I'm sure there were alienated kids in the 50s when Dan Quayle made a speech last week that said, in the 50s, I don't know if he didn't say the 50s, but he says back when we were going to school, we worried about spitwads and we worried about lockers banging shut. Now we worry about guns and drugs and, you know, our kids in a totally different climate today where you have to be much more frightened of what they could do? Go ahead, Ace.
Well, I think that the climate is different. I think that there's some research that suggests that kids tend to talk to their peers more than they talk to adults. And I think the reason for this is that we've not had adults around for a number of years. And if they are going to confide in their peers as opposed to adults, it could be that they don't trust us, or it could be that they've not had access to us. So I think that given that kind of climate that somehow drove kids away from adults and drove them to each other, suggests to us that we need to develop a different kind of schooling process where kids did feel that they had access to their teachers. If you're going to have a teacher with 29 kids in a classroom, the governor did help us a great deal by providing class size reductions, but it was limited to third grade. So I think that if we had the opportunity to reduce the class sizes for those youngsters in grades 4 through 12, perhaps youngsters would turn more to adults than to their own peers.
But Meredith, were you going to say something about today versus another generation ago?
I don't know, and I don't have any data on it, but I wonder if the parents and kids are connecting as much as with both, many parents having both to work. And I don't know whether some kids, more kids are caught in a more isolated state. The extended family isn't around back in, quote, the old days. Grandma lived down the street. You had uncles and aunts in the neighborhood. You had neighborhoods where everybody knew everybody and everybody looked out for everybody else's children. So if you didn't connect with your parents and connected with the corner grocery store man or a neighbor, I don't know. I wonder.
It's really important, though, that we differentiate between students being different, students being outside the norm, because we run the risk of trying to make everybody look the same, conform, and that
Kids do enough of that to each other.
Yeah, these acts of violence are clearly unprecedented and very serious, but they don't reflect the thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions in school, and the fact that as a teacher, as a high school principal, as a middle school principal, I've seen so many kids who were outside the norm and who were alien, but who clearly were finding their own path. And I would hate to have the result be that we find one path for all kids. And we're clearly aware of school districts where they started to move in and actually suspend, expel students, ostracize them because they looked different, acted differently. And so there's a real fine line between allowing students to be different, to have that individual sense of expression, and to foster that and to let them follow their own path, and at the same time trying to create an environment. I think that's where I'm really worried about our trying to address the issues of fear, because when we're afraid, then we react in different ways. When we're not in a state of fear, then we can be more understanding and we can reach out. And so I think there's a need to deal with the immediate and then try to look at the longer term to make sure we strike a balance.
I'm concerned about what you said, because I see no signs of anybody ostracizing children in schools, meaning the adults, because they're different, because they like one thing over another, because they're quiet. I think the issue is some of these expressions of violence that show a difference, such as violent writing that's off the norm. I mean, extremely violent writing, such as what evidently was written by those other, those boys in Littleton, or unusual and beyond the norm discussions of violence.
Well,
no one's going to prevent a child from having a psychotic break. We're not going to be able to do that. A child can have a psychotic break, and who knows what they're going to do if they have those kinds of troubles. But I would hope, because they're wearing different clothes and that sort of thing.
Well, that was in fact what happened. So in fact it was that they had different color hair, they had an earring in their ear.
Alienated by their peers, you mean?
No, they were actually by the school authorities, or wearing a trench coat.
Or sagging, for instance.
Right.
So you mean that, that the school authorities were coming down on them before the massacre happened as well?
No, I think this was after.
This
is kind of a response. This is community pressure.
I read that dress codes are more enforced now. I'm sure there's been a lot of reflex. Now, at the same time, one of the other things that's happened is that there were a rash of copycat incidents throughout the country. In fact, there was another shooting in Georgia and in Canada, but other kinds of things. In Palo Alto, we were visited by two very troubling incidents, one at JLS Middle School, where there was writing on a bathroom wall that said that kids, kind of a vague death threat, and naming a date that this would happen. And then in Gunn High School, there were swastikas painted and a kind of a murder threat by writing 187, which I watched a movie recently that had that, they did to the teacher. And this was on a Jewish administrator's office. So I'm wondering, you know, these kinds of incidents, I wonder if some of the kids just don't get it, that this is as serious as it is, if they think that the adults have basically blown all this out of proportion. And how do we communicate maybe in the curriculums itself that they have, that these are really things that need to be sensitive to.
Well, I think this is where the partnership between home and school is a critical one in the broader community. You hope for the kind of conversations at home with parents and students talking about issues on campus. I think in some cases, over time, we have all had the experience where a student has called in or has taken an action that was not intended, and so what gets labeled as a prank. I think what's been so unnerving now is that the ability to differentiate between a prank and a real situation.
Do the kids that you did catch doing the swastika thing, do they consider that what they were doing was a prank?
They would try to pass it off that way, but we surely didn't treat it that way. And I think what's happened, and it's a little bit like kids also getting on the computer and trying to tap in, is that they can head down a path that steps over those boundaries. And one of the reasons we really try to discourage that is that in some cases you have kids who were, I don't know if they were well-intentioned, but they were up to kind of lighthearted playfulness and they get carried away. Some of these others feel like they're very mean-spirited, and the one clearly a gun I think was very disconcerting because it had such a ethnic and religious kind of overtone to it that was of great concern. And obviously we try to address issues of tolerance and acceptance of diversity, want to make that happen, and there are clearly events that have happened not just recently but over time in our country that I think we all struggle with in terms of how do we make this right, how do we become more accepting, accept diversity in a state and in a country that is so diverse that we're always struggling between our glue and accepting people who are, quote, different than us.
Have you had incidents since?
Yeah, we had a scrawling on the bathroom door in the boys' room, threatening a bomb blowing up, and we took it very seriously. While on the one hand, it's highly likely that it's a prank, on the other, we took it very seriously and notified the police, notified the parents by letter, and have worked very hard to locate the culprit, which we haven't been able to. But we also had an officer come in and talk with every class. And when we talked to the kids about it, we set aside time when the discussion took place in the school, in each class, for the kids to talk about it with their teachers. And the police came in and talked about it also in every classroom, visited and talked every classroom. And so I think, as I was saying to you before the show, I think we're treating these things as a result of Littleton much more seriously in terms of acting on them.
Charlie, have you had any incidents in the district?
Yes, we had a similar incident at Belhaven School, for instance, where there was some writing in the bathroom, and of course there was a date that was given. It just happened to be June 11th when the date of graduation.
Wasn't that your date too?
Yeah, everybody, someone would be killed or something, and but luckily we were able to find the culprit, made him clean the bathroom, and we suspended him, and but we didn't go overboard because this kid is generally a nice kid, and we sort of thought that perhaps this was one occasion where he just decided to do something that was just mischievous. But we were very, very concerned about it when we read it.
Were the police brought into that?
The police was, of course we
So
brought
all
the
three
police.
of you have mentioned bringing in the police. How is that a new sort of relationship that you're now forming with your police, or are there discussions underway on how to work together without totally militarizing the campuses? Or
I've always made it a point to work very closely and collaboratively with the police. And in this case, we've had to continue to do so because we need to respond to the June 11th threat, and so we have a plan in place with the police of how to deal with June 11th. The parents have been informed of general outlines of that. We're not allowing kids to bring any gifts that day. They have to bring them the day before, put them in a certain room, this sort of thing. But at least in my experience, and that's now 4 different districts, is that working with the police in a collaborative way is essential.
Yeah, I don't think that's new. We've had acts. I think we're responding to actions that in the past might have not been perceived as a big event. Clearly the events at Gunn with the swastikas would have responded
that's
with
off the chart.
That's right. It's off the chart, and I think writing in a bathroom 6 to 9 months ago with some kind of threat might or might not have been responded in that way. Although my general rule of thumb and my experience has been it's always helpful to bring in the police and to try to look at it, because oftentimes you don't know what you might be looking at because there's all these codes and numbers. And I know we're working very closely with the Palo Alto police on a series of different efforts to work together. And then we're also going to be convening a lot of other community agencies and groups, because once again, it's not just an issue for schools and the police, it's once again for our community agencies, and I want to make sure we continue to turn around in terms of what kind of recreational activities. So we want to involve the recreational department and after-school activities, because those are the times when kids find themselves, I think, veering away. It's a time when oftentimes when parents are not home, and even if parents are home, but if kids don't have productive outlets, other ways to express themselves, I think those youngsters are more likely to find themselves troubled, but not always. But I think that's why we want to make sure we engage the broader group.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I would like to move into another area where we kind of see some of the comparisons and some of the challenges that you each face in your respective districts. So we'll join us in a moment after this message.
Sign up for one of MPAC's low-cost video production classes and create a program for the Mid-Peninsula's Electronic Town Square, Channel 6 and 77. Join a studio production crew, or borrow MPAC cameras and videotape interviews, lectures, events, and performances. Let your inner videographer out for some fun. For details, call 494-8686 or visit www.mpactv.org.
We're back with Border Crossings. I'm Elliot Margolies. Border Crossings is produced by Mid-Peninsula Access Corporation, and I'm joined today by 3 superintendents of local school districts, Dr. Charlie Mae Knight, Dr. Don Phillips, and Dr. Meredith Jones, and they span the East Palo Alto, the Ravenswood District in East Palo Alto Menlo Park, the Palo Alto Unified School District, and the Menlo Park City School District. So join us as we move to some new areas of discussion. I wanted to get into a couple of comparisons of your districts so we can learn a little bit more about them. And you may not have all these answers, so feel free to say, I pass. But if you do, I'd like to know some of the overall figures of racial diversity in your district. Whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians. Is there a general breakdown that you can share with us that you know?
Yes, my district is probably the most diverse district in San Mateo County, with about 72% of the youngsters now being language minorities, with about 1% white and about 25% black. That is a significant change. When I arrived there in 1985, the district was 85% black, and now it has made a complete change. And of course, the transition has been challenging and quite interesting.
Don?
We're
Palo Alto district.
Palo Alto is about 70% white and about 18% Asian, and then 4 or 5% African American, 3 or 4% Latino as the primary groups for the district.
And Meredith?
I think we're about about 80% white, about 10% Latino, and about 10%. The African American population is quite small. I think it's only about 3%. And then the remainder is probably Asian, but I'd have to go back and look at the statistics.
What about the amount of money per student? Is that a figure you know? the amount of funds that are available per student per year?
Depends on whether you're asking whether the amount of money we get per child from the state or whether the amount of money we spend on each child.
What you spend on each child?
Okay. We spend about $6,000.
About $6,000. And
With state funds, it's about $4,500, and with other categorical funds, it takes us up to about $5,000.
are categorical meaning grants?
Yes.
So about 5,000 with, and so some of that money is more temporary and transitional.
Yes.
Same with
but-
ours. I'm talking
okay.
the total figure.
Okay. And Don, how about in Palo Alto?
We're about
It's
7,000.
About 7,000. So, I mean, right away, it's really interesting because each district has a whole different palette in front of them of what to spend per child. I'm wondering, how does that sit with the three of you? How do you look at your position as a superintendent with the differentials from district to district?
Well, one thing I might point out is that while we clearly are on the high side, we actually are just about the national average for expenditure. And so while we have more resources than our neighbors, in many cases, the expectations for Californians, or in Palo Alto, or in our communities, clearly compare with communities that are spending, in some cases, 2 to 3 times what we're spending. Many of the districts we compete with are spending $14,000 to $16,000 to $18,000 per student.
Wow.
And so it's hard to get into that. We have always been in the position in our district that we would like to level people up, pull them up rather than to try to pull down to the lowest one. And unfortunately, California has moved from being one of the top states in terms of its funding per pupil expenditure to being well below the average, in fact, close to the bottom.
Yes.
And then when you look at cost of living issues, I think we're all struggling with how do we attract teachers, how do we attract people to be in our schools and offer the kind of programs that we want to offer for all.
Does it drive you nuts? I mean,
This is
you're
a
in
hot
2 of
topic
the
for me.
you're in 2 of the wealthiest communities in the country. You're partially in one of the wealthiest communities in the country, and you're either at average or below average for the nation. What?
This whole state, the schools are woefully underfunded. I think it's tragic what's been done here. Absolutely tragic. Having come from the East Coast in a district where the per pupil expenditure was about $10,000, New Jersey's 11, Connecticut's about 11. I couldn't support more what Don's saying, that still, he's average, we're below average, you're below average, and he's funded in a different way than Menlo Park is funded, basic aid district. We're a revenue limit district. Revenue limit districts at this stage, given the real estate values in this area, are less well funded than our basic aid neighbors. It's tragic. And there's a lot missing from the schools here because of it.
I mean, have you been tempted to go back east and work as a superintendent? And how does that sit with you to have the...
You know, I look at it as a challenge and use every opportunity that I can to raise money. In other words, rather than being an instructional leader, I've had to spend a considerable time, you know, making proposals to foundations to meet some of the special needs. Unfortunately, California does not meet the special needs of its children. And if you think we are not meeting the special needs of the regular education child, you know, try special education, and then you would really, it is really a tragedy. And there's nothing we can do. We have tried by sponsoring legislation or trying to prompt our legislators to sponsor legislation. We've had Serrano Priest decision, and we thought that we would somehow fare much better when that was passed. It didn't. When we looked at school improvement, we thought that we would get extra dollars for that. It didn't happen. It finally fizzled out too. So the only thing we could hope for is that somewhere in Sacramento, someone will come up with a magic package that will assist us in funding education as it should be.
Let me ask a couple of other comparison questions on what about the condition of buildings? How are your buildings?
Well, I've been very fortunate. During the Republican administration, my district received over $11 million of Leroy Green renovation and modernization monies. However, those dollars will probably not come this way again because the new renovation projects will probably go to those people who didn't get the money in the first place. And so I don't see a great deal of hope getting money on the next go around. But we've been very, very fortunate during this 8-year period.
So buildings have gotten some attention then and have been renovated, or?
Every school in my district has received some form of renovation. Not as extensive as I would have liked it, but
would you
there are certain
consider
things.
them cheerful places? I mean, when you look at,
Well,
they
when you think of a
painted,
district,
bathrooms all work, and
yes,
that kind of?
when you think of a district who had no renovations in 40 years, anything is a renovation.
Well, then $11 million doesn't sound like so much.
Well, to us, it sounds
Yeah.
like that's more money than that poor district has ever received in the history of that district.
How many buildings are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about 12 different schools, and so there's some substantial.
Okay, 11 million over 12 schools. Don, what about the buildings in Palo Alto?
Well, there are two parts. I think as a school district, when we've had to make choices during lean years between program and facilities and long-term maintenance, clearly the decision has been focused on program. And fortunately, the community came forward and passed Measure B, which will really provide significant dollars for us. But even that measure was scaled back significantly compared to the plans in terms of fully renovating the facilities. And I think one of the challenges that Charlie has with in Ravenswood and doing renovations is that you can paint up, fix up on the surface, but doing the real infrastructure work is a very expensive proposition.
Right. The showers can still scald you.
That's right. And so finding sufficient dollars to really do that at the elementary level, in our case middle school and high schools, and as you move through the grades, the complexity of the school site really grows dramatically when you start looking at trying to cover not only classrooms, but your gymnasiums and your science labs and your library facilities, computer labs and others that I think we all find ourselves short on the dollars to do the kind of level of effort we'd like, but we're really working hard to maximize those.
So today, $140 million in the recent bond is going to be spent really quick on all the buildings throughout the district. Is that the case, or are you going to?
Yeah, and we don't have sufficient funds to really address enrollment growth in the district, which we're experiencing. And at the secondary level, in contrast to the elementary, where we feel like because of the commitment to really split the dollars equally between the elementary and the secondary program, that we're going to be able to bring up the elementary schools to a level we're quite pleased with. I think at the secondary level, we're either going to have to do it at a lower level than we hope, or we have to make some trade-offs and then come back to the community and say, we've done these rooms and these buildings right, and now we need your support to do the next set of wings. And that's a conversation that's still underway.
And Meredith, how's your buildings?
Well, we're passed a bond in '95, and so we're halfway through the renovation of all the buildings. And also in light of your, so we're making fine progress on that, and we're very happy about that. In terms of the budget questions that you were asking earlier, another thing that we're involved with as the board is evaluating going out for parcel tax to try and address some of the underfunding needs to expand programs in the school, which we have, given the current kind of funding, you can't really make any significant improvements in program or changes in program or addition of program.
Well, there's a couple of others I'd like to ask you about and get back to the projected growth that I think all of you are expecting. But I'd like to include some of the viewers out there who have emailed or faxed. Thanks to the article in the Daily News, we have some faxes. This may be your least favorite part of the show, but I'll share some of the questions that came in. And I want all of you to be able to comment because they probably affect all three of your districts in some of these cases. This first question is, who decides if a student is to be held back, and who has the final word? And I'm wondering, I know there may be new laws that will affect your funding regarding that, and so how does that work, Dr. Knight?
Well, in my district, of course, the principal and the teacher will determine who is retained, and it's primarily really the teacher's decision. And of course, the principal will have to endorse that, validate that decision.
The new legislation calls for putting in place standards for students to be able to meet and
To be able to move on.
to be able to move to the next grade level, and a teacher can override that if in fact a student doesn't meet that, but it will really rest with the teacher. We're really working hard though with our parent community. We found that making decisions around retention are most appropriate in the early grades, and that we have the greatest success when in fact we have support from the family. And while we could make the ultimate decision, working with the family in cooperation,
Surprise.
yeah, is a really helpful piece. So.
Well, but is that a piece of legislation that you support or not? This kind of, because I'm assuming your funding may be affected by how many kids flunk or get approved.
It won't affect our funding, but I think
Okay.
it's more a concern about, once again, back to trying to manage at the state level local requirements, and what we have experienced since the funding shifted from local level to the state level has been a shift in authority, and local school boards, which are elected by the local communities, are no longer able to really develop the kind of policy that fits the community. And now what we have is policies coming forward that really one size fits all, and that while we want to be sensitive to not promoting and moving students along who are not prepared, many things weigh into a decision around promotion or retention, and those need to be weighed on an individual basis rather than a prescribed way. And I think so in that sense we're very concerned about the implementation and trying to make the best of what we think was a poorly conceived notion at the beginning, without trying to...
the trend has been away from local decision making and more into state rules that govern, that fit all? Has that been...
Oh, yeah.
Well, I want to switch over. Our viewers at home will see this on video, and you'll hear the next question. This was from a parent directing it at Superintendent Phillips, but I think it will apply to all of you. So here's our questioner.
I'd like to know if the local superintendents would consider encouraging the school districts to start benchmarking the curricula, the expectations for performance among the children against some of the finer public schools on the East Coast and in the Midwest. I know of a number of schools outside of Chicago, Boston, New York, Washington that have much deeper, richer curriculum, higher expectations for children's performance, particularly in math. It seems that our children are at least a full year behind in math, and I'm talking about those who are at the highest levels of expectation. And in many cases, there is not sufficiently intellectually challenging curriculum for advanced students. So I'd like to see more attention paid to that. Another question I have is about the size of the schools. They seem to be bursting at the seams. The facilities, I realize, are undergoing a facelift, but that doesn't address size issues. In particular, it's a concern at the middle school level, where children of this age don't seem to thrive in schools of over 1,000 students. And at the high school age, as a continuing population bulge moves through the schools, I think we have similar problems about the size of the communities there.
And that was one of our questioners. I guess the first question, which was difficult for us to hear, was about are we keeping up with the levels of math and science that are evidenced in other states throughout the country? How do you see our schools?
Well, we're very tuned into that and want to ensure that our students are very competitive, not only at the local level, state and national level, as well as internationally. And we've actually gone in and benchmarked some of the premier public schools across the country and looked at their average SAT scores, the number of national merits, And in fact, Palo Alto stands right up there with the Scarsdales, New Triers, and Chicago, and we're very, very competitive there. We continue to want to push on that end to make sure we have that in place. But being on campus and looking at the quality of work that our students demonstrate in their exhibitions, some of the senior projects, and other activities at the very high end is just overwhelming and very impressive. And we're having great success in terms of both acceptance and in terms of the kids coming back and saying, I was well prepared. We are looking at a follow-up study, which we think would give us good information about how our students are doing and how well prepared, so that would be a source of information that we could do. We also track the number of students taking 3 and 4 years of math and science, and we have large numbers who are taking higher level mathematics and science, in some cases bordering on 90%. So while we're not complacent, we think we have a good track record there. We're always open to suggestions and trying to move that agenda forward.
Meredith, are you also looking nationally and sort of doing the same sort of assessment?
I don't have a high school. Mine goes K-8, so it's a little bit different, and I have no data to suggest that our K-8 students are doing less well than high-performing
Watch it, or
districts.
you'll give the legislators the excuse to keep your funding at $6,000 per student, right?
Well, that could be. I wouldn't trust them.
What's your secret if you're doing that well with?
Well, I don't have any data to suggest we're not doing well. Whether we're doing as well as, for instance, my former district, I couldn't tell you. We use different tests. I mean, the tests here are different from the ones there. Based on the star 9 testing, it doesn't look to be a major problem. But are we doing as well as New Triers K through 8 or Scarsdale's K through 8 or my former district's K through 8? I don't have any data on that. So no, the answer is no, I don't.
Okay. The second part of the question, I want to bring you all in, and that is size. I'm assuming that you're all, I mean, the whole state is experiencing an explosion of population. How are you preparing for that? Is there any way to do that?
Our enrollment data, our projections suggest otherwise. We're leveling off.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, we had a growth and now we're leveling off. The birth rate has dropped in San Mateo County, across the county in general, according to our demographic.
But people coming in, you don't see that as a
we don't have a
major-
huge, right now we've leveled off. So.
And I'm experiencing about 125 students per year.
Extra.
And that's down because it used to be close to 300 students per year for the last 4 years. This year we're projecting about 125 students.
So you feel like your buildings are enough to, and your class sizes aren't going to be dramatically impacted by growth in the coming 5 years, say?
Well, no, I know that we're going to have to do something about buildings. And of course, like everybody else, what we do when we burst in at the seams, we add another portable. That, of course, is becoming a little trifling and at the same time sometimes expensive. But that's about the only
How many schools
alternatives.
have portables?
Every school in the district has portables in my
More
district.
than one even?
More than one.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And
For
the
class size
same in
reduction,
Palo
yeah.
Alto Unified?
Yeah.
So portables have sort of become the new architecture of,
Well, actually,
of many of our schools.
The state funding requires, if you're in the state building program, that at least a 30-year school be portables. Because they want schools to be able to grow and contract with enrollment trends over time. And so that's a deliberate strategy at the state level. At the local level, I think we have expectations and hopes that we can have fewer than that by a long shot. And so we've limited our numbers, but at this point. But as you look at funding, do you have the funding to support new permanent construction in contrast to relocatables or portable classrooms? But I think it's important to differentiate between bursting at the seams in terms of classes getting bigger, because we're holding those down, but what we're finding is the schools are getting bigger. And in Palo Alto, we opened a 12th school last year. We're growing between 200 and 300 students a year, so we're actually experiencing fairly significant growth for us. And I'm just convening now an advisory group to bring recommendations back to the school board around our middle schools and high schools, because we anticipate that they will continue to grow. And while we have relatively small elementary schools, our middle schools are quite large, There are close to 1,200 students now, and the board just passed a new ideal range of 600 to 900, which we think would be able to keep those connections. And our high schools could easily move up towards the top of our ideal range of 1,800 and exceed that. And so I think we want to look at options at the elementary, middle, and high school.
So if your options include more portables or more schools getting opened up, or possibly another questioner asked, in light of current crowded conditions of Palo Alto schools, might we be looking at year-round schooling to be included as a viable alternative to relieving overcrowding without the expense of building new schools or purchasing portables? Is that on the table?
Well, it has not been fully discussed. I've worked in as a principal and as a associate superintendent of the district with year-round education, and it's really a housing strategy. It's not an educational strategy, and that it really undercuts the sense of community because students are in different cycles. You find that families don't have the same vacations, and so my feeling for the community is if in fact we really understood year-round schools, given the expectations that we have as a school community, that we wouldn't like that option. And so we can look at it along with a whole series of others, but I think it will be very quickly dropped off once we look at other choices, and I think the desire of the community will clearly line up with having more permanent construction.
Agreed on summer
I don't have a lot of experience with it. I do know that even if you try and change the vacation times, it becomes a huge controversy in every district I've seen or heard about, because people have their idea about and plans about how they like to spend their time and the quality time with their families and that sort of thing.
It's so hot everywhere in August. Oh, I would love to travel in September.
Try New England.
May.
It isn't too bad.
Yeah.
It can be hot there, too.
I went to graduate school
That's
there.
My
right.
son's interested in it too, but it's hard to sell.
Well, I have another question, and this one is very specific to Don Phillips, and that is, there was a committee you set up to study bringing back lockers to Gunn High School and JLS, and I'm not sure if there are other, Jordan.
Yeah.
Where is it now? Where is the thinking on lockers?
Well, the committee was really set up to look at backpacks and the weight of backpacks, and there was a concern raised by the PTA last fall regarding the weight and the impact on young students and children in terms of their backs and carrying the weight. And there really are a series of issues around safety and carrying weight to and from school, and then once students are on campus. And once the school sites, councils, and PTA groups met and chatted and brought forward recommendations, I convened a district-wide committee. And I think even the supporters for lockers recognized that lockers alone were not a solution to the issue of weight and backpacks. They could potentially be part of a solution. And as we looked through, there were issues around trying to house musical instruments, to athletic bags, to how do you handle backpacks and restrooms, a whole series of issues, and to and from school with our home set of books. What we're looking at now, and talked with the committee, is that at the present time there's no funding source to even bring lockers back. And it may be the case that a local community would be interested in fundraising. We explored the option of trying to lease, and that really is not a viable option. And it can also go on unfunded lists for our Building for Excellence program, and then it can compete with other unfunded priorities. And so I think it will really now look to our local school communities to try to understand the depth of the commitment and how does that line up with other priorities, because it's always a case of prioritizing.
You don't have an opinion that we shouldn't have the lockers there if the money was there to build them again?
Well, I think it's clearly the case that when the lockers were taken out long before my arrival in the district, there were concerns at the time about vandalism, some other actions that transpired at that period of time with lockers. And there's a feeling that it has help the school climate. And so I think the discussions around lockers needs to address, if we bring them back, and if in fact they're funded, how do we do that so they're not disruptive to the learning environment? And part of that in our minds is to continue with our class set of books, which allows students to have books at home, It means they don't need to go to their lockers as often, and we don't have the weight issues going to and from school. So we're open and very receptive to trying to talk through the site issues, and we tend to find that the faculty and staff are much less inclined to go in that direction. Parents are more in line with that, but it needs to be traded off with both the priorities that the school community would set.
I'm getting the sense you don't really want the lockers, though.
Well, I'm not a locker advocate, and I'm not in opposition to lockers. I don't think it makes or breaks a great school district, but I'm also not in the mind that we can't have them and somehow it would undermine the quality. But we need to address the issues that have been raised. We've gone through a long process. We're going to implement a series of strategies to address part of it. We're very open to working with school communities around specific solutions to fund it. And maybe if we had all kinds of dollars and extra resources, you'd say, fine. But I think when you're trying to build your buildings and do other things, you have to try to weigh
I
that.
get it. But I do think it's cheaper than a chiropractor in every classroom.
Oh, we don't oppose it. And that's why we're bringing the weight down.
Yeah, okay.
And actually, just to follow up on that, we talk to schools that have lockers, and they're carrying heavy backpacks. In fact, Palo has a concern because kids are carrying around backpacks with 30 and 35 pounds as well as gun. So what we found out by talking to the places that have lockers is it doesn't solve the weight problem. And so it's really important to differentiate what lockers might do to a campus and how we can reduce the weight with home sets of books, working with teachers, and taking a series of proactive steps rather than assuming that if we have lockers then the weight problem goes away, because we're very sensitive to that and sensitive to the health and welfare of our kids.
Okay.
We want to reduce that.
Thank you. I have one. Oh, I don't have time for any more questions. Well, on the next time we get you here, if you're willing to come back, we'll gather more questions. I know that parents like myself really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you because we get very little feedback from our kids about school. It's always fine. And thank you so much for spending an afternoon, an evening here. And those of you who are tuning into Border Crossings, you can see, oh, where's my notes? You can see this program on Wednesday nights at 10 o'clock and on Channel 6 and also on 77 on June 20th and June 6th at 7:05. Thanks for joining us. Good night.